This is the Pharmaverse Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pietrack, engaging leaders from the pharma universe. Hello and welcome to the Pharmaverse Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pietrack. And if you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the pharmaceutical industry, you're in the right place. Because we interview the best, the brightest stars from every nook and corner of the pharma universe. And today's guest epitomizes a bright star. We're joined by CEO of ISPOR, Rob Abbott, and we're going to tackle topics that are not only relevant to leaders in the pharmaceutical industry, but also to each of us as potential patients. I'm very excited about this. Rob Abbott, welcome to the Pharmaverse.
Thanks so much, Michael. It's great to be able to spend some time with you on the Pharmaverse podcast today.
Yeah, well, I'm eager for everyone to learn about all that you're changing and how you're changing the impact of ISPOR on health policy. But I think where we should start is at the very beginning. What is ISPOR?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the opportunity to introduce ISPOR in some respects to some of your listeners. I'm sure others already know of us, but ISPOR is the Professional Society for Health Economics and Outcomes Research, or HEOR, as we sometimes like to call it. And in simple terms, HEOR is a multidisciplinary science that focuses on the real value of a healthcare intervention and its capacity to frankly improve the quality of life of patients. So as you suggested off the top, there's probably lots to explore here today in the context of all of us have been patients or will be patients or know someone who's a patient. And HEOR has a lot to offer in that domain. And I might add that ISPOR is the world's largest and most influential professional society focused on advancing HEOR excellence.
Amazing. Awesome. And I know we're going to get into it more later, but there's a lot of CEOs in our audience. And so if you could speak directly to them and really talk about the value of HEOR to a pharma company.
Yeah, this is a very timely and topical item to explore. And I think that on the one hand, there's an adage that there is no access without evidence. And HEOR scientists are the primary generators or curators of that scientific evidence. So on the one hand, there's a rock solid business case that, look, if you want your drug or your product to get into the market, you want to backstop any of your marketing push with real scientific evidence. And that's what HEOR offers. But I would actually go further and say that HEOR adds value from early stage development through late stage drug development into market access, pricing, and reimbursement, and so forth. And so there's an opportunity, I think, to think about HEOR a little differently, a little more strategically, and realize that it can offer strategic input on access and pricing decisions, clinical trial design, the ways in which real-world evidence can inform redesign, and so forth. So I think HEOR offers a lot of value, and certainly one of the things that I'm making a priority at ISPOR is reaching out to those members of our society in the pharmaceutical space, and CEOs in particular, to actually understand what do they see as the pain points, and how can I and ISPOR address those pain points?
Now let's think about governmental agencies. When we spoke earlier, you were saying ISPOR is doing a lot to help governmental agencies see the value of HEOR. So we spoke to the CEO, but now what is the narrative to a governmental agency?
The science lives in its application. and really what I mean by that is that historically, ISPOR as a scientific society has really prided itself on curating exceptional science, seeing that through to publication. And then if some policymaker or staffer in Washington came across that research study, great, that's a happy accident. We're being much more intentional now. And one of the things that I'm really championing as CEO is, firstly, we need to ensure that we have a dissemination strategy around the work that we curate. So anything, for instance, that appears in our flagship journal, Value in Health, that's largely an academic audience. So I want plain language summaries of those seminal reports. And I want a strategy around who needs to know about this in DC? Who needs to know about this elsewhere? Also, we're stepping up our level of engagement with key government agencies such as the FDA and CMS in the United States, the European Medicines Agency in Europe, and their counterparts across the globe to help bridge the gap, so to speak, between the science and the decision-making process. And we know that scientific evidence is simply one of many factors that help to contribute to a decision-making space, but it's a critically important one. And our motto is that, all great policy decisions should rest on a foundation of exceptional science. And we want to make that much, much more accessible to policymakers in Washington and elsewhere.
This is a lot more than a professional society, Rob. I mean, if you guys can go in and actually impact policy, that's huge.
Well, this is the aspiration, and this really leads into our new strategy, because in many respects, for most of its history, and ISPOR is celebrating its 30th anniversary next year, but for most of its history, ISPOR has frankly aspired to become a professional society. The idea of actually having an impact on policy or what have you, that was kind of a happy accident. And so now, we've achieved that status as a professional society. And what I want us to be doing is leveraging that strength and being much, much more intentional about saying it's not about becoming a professional society anymore. It's actually about how we transform healthcare, how we make healthcare more accessible, effective, efficient, and affordable. It's a big ask, obviously, but I think we have the wherewithal to actually take a seat at the table and say, look, HEOR is not a cure-all, but the evidence that we can provide and the perspective that we can provide can go a long way towards cutting through the noise that too often surrounds healthcare and health decision-making and offer some solutions.
Yeah, you mentioned Flagship in Health. Is that what the name of the journal?
A Value in Health is ISPOR's flagship journal, yeah.
Oh, I see. Where does one find that?
It's available online. And so all one has to do is go to ispor.org and they can access it.
Awesome. Okay. The reason I wanted you to be on this show is to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, because it is the topic. I talk about it every phone call I'm on. I know it's on the minds of all the listeners that are listening. So first of all, what is the IRA as it relates to healthcare?
So the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 is a very consequential piece of legislation in many respects. As it applies to healthcare, probably the most significant thing, so to speak, that your listeners will be paying attention to is that for the first time, this is federal legislation that includes provisions to lower the cost and negotiate the price of prescription drugs for people with Medicare. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this is a very important event. The articulation of a lower maximum fair price for drugs, this is a very significant evolutionary event for healthcare in the US. Not without controversy, obviously, as anything in healthcare would likely be. But if you sort of imagine a scenario where Medicare patients could have insulin, for instance, available at $35 a month when we know the price of insulin has been skyrocketing, when there's a yearly cap on out-of-pocket prescription drug costs, those are potentially very significant benefits for patients. Now, on the flip side, if drug companies raise the price of drugs faster than the rate of inflation, they're required under the legislation to pay Medicare a rebate. So there's lots to unpack here in the IRA, but it's, I would say, a very, very significant development. It's something that ISPOR has been watching very, very closely. And I'm also pleased to say that we've been providing where we can evidence to help inform some of the decisions that are being taken. but it's going to be a long time to kind of properly assess how this is really playing out.
Yeah, you said it. It's one of the most critical, consequential pieces of legislature, I think is how you said it. And it's so true. But I see it as like this paradox. We all want medicine to be more affordable. No one's against that. No one's against that.
Yeah.
But if we cut the legs of pharma and make it not as beneficial for them to create innovative drugs, then we're creating an even bigger problem. So from your vantage point, what is the fix?
So one of the things that I really value about being the CEO of ISPOR is that on a daily basis, I get to experience firsthand the multi-stakeholder nature of healthcare and the multi-stakeholder nature of ISPOR. So, the fix, as you call it, Michael, is to remember and think about the entire healthcare ecosystem. So pharma, and what we like to call on occasion big pharma in particular, has historically been absolutely critical in driving innovation in healthcare. And I want to emphasize that primary role that pharma has played in driving innovation has not gone away. Pharma is still absolutely critical, especially in designing and funding clinical trials, navigating regulatory approvals, and so on. At the same time, and I think this is exciting, at the same time, we're now seeing innovation bubble up from other sources as well. So, a lot of smaller companies that are spin-offs from university research hubs that are typically funded by the NIH and philanthropies, these energetic companies are actually driving innovation as well. So you've got that side of things. And at the same time, I would like us to remember, our pandemic experience and the experience of things like Operation Warp Speed that showed that government and industry collaborating can actually drive to solutions very, very quickly. We can expedite clinical trials and make them faster and cheaper. So again, when we think about innovation, we need to be thinking about the entire ecosystem instead of just looking at pharma. Pharma, and I want all my pharma listeners to hear me on this, you're still critical. And we need to be looking for those other pockets of innovation that are coming from other stakeholders and harness that to really drive whole system change.
This episode is brought to you by K. Bassman International, the leader in pharma and biotech recruiting. When pharma executives need to make critical hires, they go to the experts at K. Bassman, pharma's one-source staffing solution. Visit kbic.com. Now back to the episode. Well, what are some of the innovative ways that companies are going about reimbursement, getting drugs paid for, even in crowded markets? Have you seen anything innovative?
I think the best way I might respond to that question, Michael, is to say that, the fundamental things that inform a company's ability to get its drug in the market and reimbursed, uniqueness, effectiveness, the positioning of that drug relative to competition, these things haven't gone away. And by the way, these things are all areas where a more deeply embedded commitment or partnership with HEOR can help. These are the things that companies need to be paying really close attention to if they want to get their drugs paid for, especially in a crowded market.
I spoke to a couple people that are in HEOR and told them I was going to be speaking with you. And they're like, really? That's awesome. I go, so what would you ask him if you got to host this podcast? And one person had a really great question. He wanted to know if outcomes-based contracts are becoming more vogue. Is there a big push for that, or can you speak to that?
What I would say, I think, Michael, is that we talk about health economics and outcomes research. And it's not as though health economics is, kind of played out, discipline by any stretch. I would say, though, that outcomes research is becoming much, much more prominent. And there are a variety of good reasons for this, not the least being the primacy of patient-reported outcomes, real-world experience, and so forth, and feeding that into drug development and healthcare interventions more generally. So I would say that outcomes research is taking on more and more of a prominent role in healthcare planning and decision making.
What do you see as the impact of AI in all this? Like when you're thinking about outcomes, is that, I know you said you have a task force for AI. What do you see as AI's impact over the next 10 years?
Well, I guess I should probably begin with the standard caveat that, AI, there is a lot of concern about an omnibus approach to this. But I think as it relates to healthcare, I think there's huge potential here. I really do. And it's obviously shown up pretty consistently as one of the top trends that ISPOR tracks on a regular basis. I think in particular, the ability to expedite data mining, to tailor treatment regimes, the ability to do large-scale literature reviews to inform research, the ability to synthesize patient-reported outcomes. These are all areas where I think we're going to see AI play a very, very significant role going forward.
And, I got to think, with the 30-year anniversary coming up, you're thinking about, the long-range vision of ISPOR. What's on the horizon for ISPOR over the next 5 years as well?
Well, it's a great segue into our 2030 strategy, actually. So I mentioned earlier that for most of its history, ISPOR, was very steadily progressing towards achieving status as a legitimate professional society, if you will. Well, mission accomplished on that front. Soon after my arrival, and I had the great benefit of arriving after a lot of that missionary work had been done, I met with the chair of my board and said, it's time that we leverage some of the capital that we've built up over time and really forged a bold new strategy. So a couple quick things to mention here. I've alluded to our vision previously. Our new vision is a world where healthcare is accessible, effective, efficient, and affordable. We want to bring or help bring the very best that medical science has to offer to the largest number of patients at reasonable cost. And of course, any one of our listeners today could probably parse that and go, well, what's reasonable and so on. But I think the general, gist is there. In support of that vision, ISPOR is really going to be looking at our mental models, I suppose, around health. We tend to think of health as a physical thing, but increasingly concepts of whole health or well-being are becoming much more in vogue. And that means that as health economists and outcomes researchers, we're going to be expanding the aperture through which we view value and saying, okay, how do we think about and measure value in a broader context? And critically as well, how do we take whatever research we're doing and make that relatable to a wide audience? And in particular, how do we make that relatable to the pharma CEO who sometimes wonders, what is the ROI I'm getting on HEOR? But equally, how do we make that relatable to a policymaker in DC who's faced with a bewildering array of questions and challenges related to decision making? So my hope is that over the next 5 years, ISPOR moves from being a kind of recognized, trusted voice in the healthcare space to being the unchallenged, preeminent innovator in HEOR, and by extension is leveraging that innovation to transform healthcare.
I mean, you said it yourself, bold. It's bold because ISPOR has been a fairly conservative group over the last 30 years. And this is a bold move, Rob. I mean, as a CEO, are you facing tailwinds or headwinds on this?
I have to give a shout out here to the ISPOR board, because one of the pull factors for me, certainly in joining the organization 2 years ago, was the quality of the board. Super engaged, and I think crucially understands that they need to take a strategic long-term view and not get buried in the weeds of day-to-day operations. And I also want to give a shout out to my extraordinary team I'm very, very fortunate to have a senior leadership team and a staff team that is fired up about the new vision and the new strategy. And so I would say that we're like that metaphorical snowball that's rolling downhill and gathering momentum, and there's a feeling of, okay, we could actually do this. So it's pretty exciting.
Well, speaking of metaphors, I got to compliment you on that picture behind you. I mean, it's like you are above the forest. You are above the trees looking out. And I've asked you, how is AI going to impact us in the future? How is ISPOR going to impact the future? Now let's talk even more broadly and just say, what do you see in the future of pharma? What changes? What challenges? What do you see in the future for pharma?
The pharmaceutical industry has been, for me at least, has been a source of such excitement for so many years, because I think that there's this wonderful and at times daunting collision of commerce on the one hand and helping people on the other. I mean, at the end of the day, I think all of us that work in the healthcare space, whether we're in the pharma industry, whether we're researchers or payers or regulators, it doesn't really matter where we are. We're working in service of patients somewhere. And so I think that what we'll likely see for pharma specifically is that there will continue to be an evolution and an evolution in thinking. I think they will remain a dominant player in healthcare, especially over the next 5 to 10 years. We'll continue to see the usual sorts of reorganizations and things of that nature, but we'll also see some energetic new companies come to the fore. We'll continue to see, and I'm happy about this actually, we'll continue to see disruptors. I mean, one of the things that's really exciting for me is just looking at the healthcare space and how it's shifting with what I sometimes refer to as non-traditional players stepping in because they see an unsatisfactory equilibrium and they think they can offer something better. And the pharma industry is going to have to respond to that in many respects. So I'm expecting continued innovation. I'm expecting new players to step forward and emerge. But I expect fundamentally the industry to remain a very key player as we think about how we make healthcare better.
I really love the image of the crossroad of commerce and doing good for people. And there's this saying in pharma, do good and you'll do well. Do good, do well. And that's always been the lead, is to do good for people. And by doing that, there will be a financial benefit as well. As you look forward, not only in the present, but also in the future, this is sort of a selfish question, but where do you see HEOR being placed in an organization? Because I place a lot of people in medical affairs and in HEOR. Sometimes it's a medical affairs function. Sometimes it's a commercial function. From your standpoint, where does it fit best?
I can almost imagine some of your listeners leaning forward now in their chairs listening to this. I think in many respects, and I think some of the pharma CEOs that may be listening would hopefully reinforce this view. I don't know that it necessarily matters where the HEOR function is situated, but what does matter, and I'm very sincere when I say this, I think what does matter is that the scientific rigor and the curation of evidence, especially at a time when evidentiary requirements are actually increasing, that's what really, really matters. And so, organizational changes are nothing new. But I would simply say, ISPOR is here to offer a perspective and a point of view, and ideally to help. If any CEO or C-suite executive, is thinking about HEOR, I would simply say the fundamental thing is not to dilute the scientific integrity that drives the evidence generation. Because at the end of the day, access, pricing, reimbursement, all of these decisions rest on that foundation of scientific integrity. So place the focus there ensure that there is rigor and unbiased attention to scientific detail, and everything else will fall into place.
I'm going to have to talk to our editor to make your lips say, put it in medical affairs. Michael Pietrack will fill it. Well, the Pharmaverse podcast is a leadership podcast at its very core. And so I want to ask you a leadership question. And again, this is another self-serving one. I'm trying to create change in a new organization. You're trying to reinvigorate a 30-year-old culture and doing some new things. I'm curious, as a leader, what are some best practices that you would share for leaders who are also trying to gain buy-in to advance change in their organization?
We could have an entire podcast on that one question.
Maybe we will.
Which I would love, by the way. The key thing I find is that, firstly, you have to be real, and sometimes, in my case, I will say, coming new into ISPOR, it's sometimes important to name some things. So I will tell you, on my first day with my new staff at ISPOR, I said, look, I'm new. You have no reason today to trust me because we don't have any history together. But what I'm asking of you is that you have faith that your actual experience with me, especially in the first 90 days, is going to start to establish trust. Because once we do that, then there's no limit to what we can do. And so the first and most important thing is just to understand that you need to create trust. So how do you do that? Well, you keep your promises. You walk the talk. You lead from the front. You bring your real authenticity, to bear. And there's a certain, for want of a better word, I would just say passion. I love what I do. I love having the privilege of leading an organization, but I love even more the fact that this organization's purpose is fundamentally about helping people. And so I think what I've noticed is, people respond to that passion, and they respond as well when they see, in my case, when they see me out there, on the stump, so to speak. Look, this is why this matters. They see me talking about this or writing about this or, putting my shoulder next to theirs as we try to push something forward. So there's I think an element of, and here's the alchemy I would suggest, because everything I've described kind of suggests that I'm right in there with my team. And that is true, but only to a point, because I think it's critical that you not be top down or bottom up, but somehow a mix of both, that you co-create that vision. And then as a CEO, you want to step back a little bit, and you want to let people use their creativity. I'm a huge proponent of rapid prototyping and the articulation of minimum viable products and so forth. And so I like to help create that initial vision and then let my team experiment and try things. And especially as we're shifting the culture and making ISPOR a little more entrepreneurial, or a lot more entrepreneurial than it might once have been, in its thinking at least, it's absolutely critical to establish that trust, and then allow people to experiment, knowing that, a little bit like venture capital, a lot of this stuff isn't going to work, but you're going to learn some things, and that allows you then to make the next breakthrough. So for me, the leadership model is really one of showing up every day with your full authenticity and your full passion, and at the same time, creating that set of conditions in which your team knows that they can experiment, that they can, quote unquote, fail from time to time and not risk punishment, because it's all in service of this bigger picture.
Oh man, great. I'm so glad we had that recorded. That's going to be a great soundbite. You have so much passion about this. I can't wait to meet you. Where and when is the next ISPOR conference?
So the next North American conference, we have two conferences or congresses that are truly global in scale each year. The next North American one will be in Montreal, Canada, in May of 2025. And our next European conference will be in Glasgow, Scotland in November of 2025. And again, anyone is more than welcome to attend, and they just have to go to ISPOR.org, and all the details for attendance will be easily found there.
So it's ISPOR.org.
You
right?
got it. You got it.
Well, I would encourage all to go there, attend the Congress, and also Rob Abbott is a great follow on LinkedIn. But can you believe a half hour went by that quickly?
It was awesome, Michael. I so enjoyed having this opportunity, and I hope we get to do this again sometime.
Well, I learned so much, and I know our listeners did too, so we will do it again. Thank you so much for joining us on the Pharmaverse.
Pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us on the Pharmaverse Podcast. Make sure you subscribe below so you don't miss any leadership insights. Like and comment. I would love to hear from you. We'll see you on the next episode of Pharmaverse.